King Charles III just stuns the entire United Kingdom by executing a breathtaking, calculated act of sovereign defiance that no living monarch has ever dared attempt, severing the entire palace communications network in a single, devastating stroke to rewrite the most sacred document in the British constitutional framework, his last will and testament, without a single witness, without a single advisor, without the knowledge of his own heir. This is not a story about a man updating his paperwork. This is the story of a king who, in the dead of night, dismantled every safeguard the institution had erected around him, locked himself inside a fortress of silence, and rewrote the financial future of the House of Windsor with a trembling hand and a ruthless clarity that has left Buckingham Palace in a state of suffocating, agonizing paralysis. What exactly did Charles alter in those devastating midnight amendments that has rendered Prince William financially vulnerable for the first time in his adult life? Why did the king deliberately sever every digital artery connecting him to his own staff, his own family, his own son, as though he feared interception from within his own household? And what dark, hidden clause buried in centuries-old estate law gave him the legal authority to circumvent every protocol designed to prevent precisely this kind of unilateral monarchical power? The scene unfolds in the private study of the king's apartments at Clarence House on a frost-covered Tuesday evening in late January, the kind of night where London's ancient stones seem to contract against the bitter cold and the Thames runs black and silent beneath Westminster Bridge. The room itself is a monument to accumulated power. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelving lined with Morocco-bound legal volumes, a Persian rug of deep burgundy and gold thread worn thin at the center from decades of sovereign footfall, and above the marble fireplace, a portrait of George III whose pale, watchful eyes seem to track every movement below. The desk, a massive Victorian partner's desk of English oak with brass fittings tarnished to the color of old honey, dominates the room's center, and upon it sits a single cream-colored legal folder, perhaps 14 pages thick, bound with crimson ribbon and sealed at the spine with a wax impression bearing the personal cipher of the king. The only light comes from a green-shaded banker's lamp whose glow pools across the desk's surface, catching the edges of a Mont Blanc fountain pen uncapped and resting in a shallow groove, its nib still wet with ink so fresh it glistens. Beyond the mullioned windows, the security lights of the palace grounds cast long angular shadows across the frosted lawn. And inside the study, the only sound is the rhythmic, measured tick of an 18th-century long-case clock standing sentinel in the corner, each swing of its brass pendulum marking another second of what will prove to be the most consequential night in the modern history of the British monarchy. Charles sits alone. The door is locked from within, not merely closed, but locked with a brass key that now rests in his waistcoat pocket, pressed against his chest. His valet has been dismissed. His private secretary has been sent home with instructions so unusual, so contrary to established protocol, that the man had stood in the doorway for a full 11 seconds before retreating, his face drained of color. The king's reading glasses rest low on his nose, and his fingers, those famous fingers, paint-stained and earth-worn from decades of watercolor and garden soil, trace the paragraphs of the document before him with the reverence and terror of a man handling explosives. He has activated something tonight that no one outside this room fully comprehends yet. At precisely 9:47 that evening, a command was issued from within this study, not verbally, not through the usual encrypted channels of royal communication, but through a physical override switch concealed within the desk's false-bottom drawer, that severed the palace's internal digital network. Every server, every email relay, every monitoring feed connecting Clarence House to Buckingham Palace, to Kensington Palace, to the Privy Council's secure archives, all of it went dark in a single devastating instant. The system administrators at the Royal Household's IT division would later describe the event in hushed, disbelieving tones as a total architectural collapse, though the truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. The king had pulled the plug, deliberately, with his own hand. The year was 1994, and Charles was not yet a king but a prince trapped in the wreckage of a marriage the world had watched disintegrate on live television. He sat in the back seat of a Daimler moving through the rain-slicked streets of Highgrove's surrounding village, and beside him sat a man whose name has never appeared in any official court circular, a solicitor of extraordinary discretion whose family had served the Duchy of Cornwall's legal interests for 4 generations. The man spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain on the car's roof, and what he said that evening planted a seed that would take 3 decades to germinate. There exists, Your Royal Highness, a clause within the sovereign's estate framework, a legal escape mechanism written into the original charter by your great-great-grandmother's advisors, that permits the reigning monarch to amend testamentary instruments without the countersignature of the Lord Chancellor, provided, and only provided, that the amendment is executed in conditions of complete communicative isolation from the Crown's administrative apparatus. Charles had turned slowly, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "You mean to say," he rasped, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent years feeling surveilled within his own life, "that if I were to sever myself entirely from the machinery, entirely, I could act alone?" The solicitor had merely inclined his head, a single, almost imperceptible nod. That conversation lasted 11 minutes. Neither man ever spoke of it again, until tonight. Back in the present, the clock strikes 10, and somewhere in the bowels of Buckingham Palace, a junior communications officer named Marcus Trent, 28 years old, 3 months into the most prestigious posting of his career, stares at a bank of monitors that have gone simultaneously, catastrophically black. His coffee mug freezes halfway to his lips. The screens do not flicker. They do not display error codes. They simply cease. It is as though the entire digital nervous system of the British monarchy has been excised with a surgeon's blade. Trent reaches for the internal phone. Dead. He tries his encrypted tablet. No signal. He stands, his chair rolling backward with a sharp crack against the console behind him. And for a long, terrible moment, he is alone in a room full of dead machines, the only sound his own ragged breathing and the distant muffled chime of Big Ben carrying across the river. He does not yet understand what has happened. He will not understand for another 6 hours. But his hands are already trembling, because Marcus Trent has been trained to recognize one specific scenario above all others, a scenario drilled into him during his first week, a scenario so unlikely it was presented almost as historical curiosity, and that scenario is this: total sovereign isolation. The king has gone dark. 14 miles away, in the private apartments of Kensington Palace, Prince William is reading to his youngest child when his personal mobile phone emits a sound he has never heard it make before. A low, sustained tone, almost subsonic, that causes the device to vibrate with such intensity it slides across the mahogany side table and crashes to the floor. He retrieves it with the father's practiced calm, careful not to alarm the child, and reads the message displayed on the locked screen. It is not a text. It is not a notification from any application he recognizes. It is a system-level alert, white text on a black background, and it reads simply: Sovereign network disconnected. No Oberfahrt available. Refer to Privy Council Protocol 7. William's face does not change. His voice does not waver as he finishes the bedtime story, kisses his child's forehead, and quietly exits the nursery. But in the hallway, in the long, portrait-lined corridor of apartment 1A, where the faces of dead kings watch from gilded frames, his composure fractures. His hand finds the wall. His knuckles go white against the wainscoting. He stands very still for perhaps 10 seconds, and then he moves, rapidly, toward his own study, his stride lengthening with each step until he is nearly running, his reflection flashing across the darkened windows like a ghost pursuing itself. The men in gray had anticipated many scenarios. They had war-gamed successions, abdications, scandals, and constitutional crises with the cold efficiency of military strategists operating from behind mahogany conference tables. But they had never, not once in their decades of invisible governance, anticipated that the sovereign himself would turn against the machinery. The particular man who concerns us tonight is known within the palace's inner corridors only by his position, the comptroller of the royal estate. He has held this role for 19 years. He wears charcoal suits of impeccable cut, polished Oxford shoes that click with metronomic precision against marble floors, and he carries a leather portfolio, never a briefcase, always a portfolio, that contains at any given moment the complete financial architecture of the House of Windsor. His eyes are gray, his hair is silver, his face is the kind of face that passes through rooms without registering in memory. He is not royal by blood, not aristocratic by birth, but he wields more practical power over the crown's assets than any individual save the sovereign himself. Tonight, at approximately 10:15, this man receives a phone call on his personal line, not his office line, not his encrypted line, but the private number known to fewer than 6 people on Earth. The caller is a junior aide at Clarence House, and the aide's voice carries the unmistakable tremor of someone delivering news they know will trigger catastrophe. Sir, the king has activated Protocol Omega. The network is severed. We have no access to the estate documents. He appears to be amending the will. The comptroller says nothing for 4 seconds. Then, in a voice as flat and cold as Arctic ice, he whispers, "Get me the Lord Chancellor, now." But the Lord Chancellor cannot be reached. No one can be reached. The king has not merely severed the palace network. He has activated a cascade of communications blocks that extend, like concentric rings of silence, outward from Clarence House to encompass every secure government channel connected to the royal estate. The fail-safes that were designed to protect the sovereign from external threats have been turned inward, weaponized against the very institution they were built to serve. Charles knew precisely what he was doing. He had studied the system for 30 years, not as a king studies, with delegated authority and summarized briefings, but as a man studies, with obsessive, private, midnight attention to detail. He knew every relay, every node, every vulnerability. And tonight he exploited them all. The year was 2002, and Charles stood in the private chapel at Sandringham on a rain-lashed November afternoon, attending the reading of the Queen Mother's supplementary estate documents. He was 53 years old, still a decade from imagining himself as king. And yet something in the dry, precise voice of the Queen Mother's solicitor caught his attention with the force of a physical blow. The solicitor was describing a particular provision, a clause that had been inserted into the Queen Mother's will at her personal insistence in 1961, that explicitly bypassed the standard oversight mechanisms of the royal household. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the solicitor read, his voice echoing off the chapel's limestone walls. did exercise her prerogative to amend instruments of testamentary intent under conditions of sovereign isolation, as permitted by the Regency and Estate Charter of 1893. Charles had leaned forward in his pew. The chapel smelled of cold stone and beeswax candles, and somewhere outside, a groundskeeper's dog was barking at the wind. The clause existed, it was real, it had been used before. And in that moment, Charles understood, with a clarity that made his chest tighten and his breath hitch, that the institution he served could also be circumvented by the very legal architecture it had built to protect itself. He filed this knowledge away like a man hiding a key beneath a floorboard. He did not speak of it, he did not research it further. He simply held it, silently, for over 2 decades, waiting for the night when he would need it, and now that night has arrived. The cream-colored folder lies open on the desk, its crimson ribbon untied, its pages spread in a careful fan beneath the lamplight. Charles's pen moves with deliberate, unhurried strokes, not the hasty scrawl of a man in panic, but the measured calligraphy of a man who has rehearsed this moment in his mind for years. The amendments are devastating in their precision. The Duchy of Cornwall, that vast ancient estate encompassing over 52,000 hectares of English soil, generating revenues in excess of £23 million annually, is being restructured, not dismantled, not sold, restructured. The standard succession protocols that would have automatically transferred full operational control to Prince William upon Charles's death are being replaced with a tiered system of conditional access. William will inherit the title. William will inherit the ceremonial role. But the financial architecture, the investment portfolios, the commercial leases, the agricultural revenues, the property developments, will be held in a sovereign trust with a 30-year lock, accessible to the heir only upon the satisfaction of conditions that Charles is now, in his precise hand, committing to legal permanence. The implications are staggering. William, as future king, would ascend to the throne without independent financial power. He would reign, but he would not control. The distinction is everything. Across London, William has reached his study. The room is smaller than his father's, more modern, less weighed down by centuries of accumulation, but tonight it feels like a cell. He has attempted 17 calls in the past 12 minutes. His private secretary's line returns dead static. The Clarence House switchboard is unreachable. Even the emergency military liaison, the channel maintained specifically for royal family crises, responds only with a recorded message he has never heard before. The sovereign has invoked communicative isolation. No external connections are currently authorized. Please stand by. William does not throw the phone. He does not shout. Instead, he does something far more telling. He sits down, very slowly, at his desk, places both palms flat on the surface, and closes his eyes. His breathing is controlled, measured, the product of years of military training and a lifetime of performing composure under public scrutiny. But behind those closed eyelids, calculations are running at a speed that would terrify the men in gray if they could witness it. William is not panicking. William is assessing. And what he is assessing, with cold and growing clarity, is the possibility that his father has just executed the most extraordinary act of financial warfare in the history of the British monarchy. Against his own son. The clock strikes 11. In the comptroller's residence, a discreet Georgian townhouse in Belgravia, furnished with the anonymous good taste of a man who has spent decades being invisible, the senior courtier stands at his drawing-room window, staring at his own reflection in the black glass. His portfolio lies open on the hall table, its contents useless tonight. Every document within it references a financial architecture that may at this very moment be ceasing to exist. He has managed, through a circuitous chain of personal contacts, to reach 2 other members of what the palace internally calls the Estate Steering Committee, men of similar invisibility and similar power, and their collective assessment is unanimous and terrifying. If the king has invoked the isolation clause of the 1893 Charter, there is no legal mechanism to stop him. The clause was designed as a protection, a way for the sovereign to act without coercion in times of crisis, but it contains no requirement that the crisis be external. A sovereign who perceives threat from within his own household has precisely the same legal authority to invoke it as one facing foreign espionage. The comptroller picks up his phone one final time, dials a number from memory, and when the voice on the other end answers, he speaks just 6 words. He has outmaneuvered us all. It is worth pausing here to understand what is truly at stake, not merely in pounds and hectares, but in the fundamental power structure of the British monarchy. For centuries, the heir to the throne has derived practical authority not from the crown itself, but from the independent financial base provided by the Duchy of Cornwall. It is this independence, this ability to operate, invest, employ, and influence without relying on parliamentary grants or government oversight, that gives the Prince of Wales genuine power, rather than merely ceremonial significance. A future king without the duchy's independent revenue stream would be, in the most practical sense, a captive monarch, dependent upon whatever financial structures his predecessor chose to leave behind. Charles understands this. He has lived this. For over 50 years, the duchy was his identity, his independence, his proof that he existed as more than a waiting room for kingship. And now, in the most devastating irony imaginable, He is using that very understanding to ensure his son experiences precisely the vulnerability he himself escaped. The question that haunts this narrative is not what, but why. The year was 2019, and Charles sat opposite his eldest son in the morning room at Highgrove on a crystalline December morning, frost still white on the hedgerows beyond the leaded windows. The conversation that took place in that room has never been reported, not by any journalist, not by any biographer, not by any of the endless parade of senior royal sources who feed Britain's insatiable tabloid appetite. But those who were present in the house that morning, a housekeeper, a protection officer stationed in the adjacent corridor, would later describe, in the most careful and circumspect terms, the sound of raised voices. Not shouting, the Windsors do not shout, but voices raised to a pitch and intensity that caused the housekeeper to pause, cloth in hand, and the protection officer to shift his weight forward onto the balls of his feet. What was said cannot be confirmed with certainty, but what is known, what has been pieced together from the behavioral evidence of the months that followed, is that William expressed, in terms of unprecedented directness, his intention to restructure the duchy's operational management upon his accession. The word modernize was used. The word streamline was used. And Charles heard, in those reasonable progressive princely words, something that chilled him to his marrow. He heard the sound of his life's work being erased. He heard efficiency replacing passion. He heard spreadsheets replacing soil. And in that moment, something shifted in the relationship between father and son, a hairline fracture, invisible to the world, but felt by both men with the acute sensitivity of those who have spent their lives performing closeness for cameras. Back in the present, midnight approaches, and Charles is on the 11th page of his amendments. His hand has not trembled, his pen has not paused. The study is now thick with the particular silence that descends when a building knows its occupant is awake and working. The kind of silence that seems to press inward, as though the walls themselves are listening. The green lamp casts its pool of light, and beyond that pool, the room's corners have fallen into genuine darkness. The fire in the grate has burned to embers, casting no warmth, merely a faint orange glow that catches the brass fittings of the desk and turns them to copper. Charles does not look up. He does not stretch, does not rise for water or tea. He writes with the concentration of a man who knows he has a limited window, not because the isolation clause has a time limit, but because eventually, inevitably, the apparatus will find a way to reach him. They always do. The men in gray have survived world wars, abdications, and constitutional crises. They will not be held at bay by a communications blackout forever. But tonight is his. At 12:17 in the morning, Prince William's landline rings. Not his mobile, his landline. The heavy cream-colored telephone that sits on the sideboard in the drawing room of apartment 1A. A relic from a previous era that Catherine insisted on keeping for its aesthetic charm. William has not heard this phone ring in over a year. He crosses the room in 4 strides and lifts the receiver. And the voice that greets him is not his father's. It is the voice of Sir Edward Marsh Whitley, the King's senior private secretary, a man of 63 who has served 3 members of the royal family across 4 decades, and whose voice in all that time has never been heard to waver. Tonight it wavers. Your Royal Highness, Marsh Whitley raffs, and the sound is terrible, the sound of institutional certainty collapsing, of a man whose entire professional existence has been predicated on control now confronting the absolute absence of it. Sir, I must inform you. The King has invoked the charter provision. He is amending testamentary documents. We have been unable to. A pause, a sound that might be a swallow, might be a suppressed sob. We have been unable to intervene. The legal framework does not permit, sir. I am so terribly sorry. William's response, when it comes, is a masterclass in the particular Windsor talent for compressing devastation into monosyllables. I understand, he says. And then, after a pause so long that Marsh Whitley checks twice to confirm the line is still connected. How long has he been planning this? The silence that follows tells William everything. Marsh Whitley does not know, which means Charles has been planning this entirely alone. Which means the King has trusted no one in his household, not his secretary, not his advisors, not his comptroller. He has operated as a solitary agent within his own palace, and no one detected it. The scale of that deception, the patience of it, the absolute control it required, William recognizes it instantly, because it is precisely the kind of discipline his father taught him. The son was trained by the very man who is now using that training's mirror image against him. Across the city, something extraordinary is happening. The silence that should have remained confined to the palace's internal systems is beginning to leak. At the BBC's broadcasting house, a night editor monitoring the royal press feeds notices that every single automated update from the royal household's communications office has ceased. The timestamp of the last update reads 21:47. It is now 0:23. In 37 years of continuous royal press monitoring, the BBC has never experienced a gap of more than 90 minutes. This gap is approaching 3 hours. The night editor makes a call to the duty royal correspondent, who makes a call to a contact at the palace press office, who does not answer. A second call. A third. Nothing. The correspondent sits up in bed, fully awake now, her journalist's instinct firing with the particular electricity that precedes a major story. She does not yet know what is happening, but she knows something is happening. And by morning, 20 million people will know it too. The year was 2012, and Charles walked alone through the formal gardens of Dumfries House in Scotland, a property he had personally rescued from destruction, purchasing it with duchy funds in a transaction that the men in grey had fought with every weapon in their considerable arsenal. It was early autumn, and the estate's ancient oaks were turning gold at their edges, and Charles moved among them with the slow, deliberate gait of a man communing with something larger than himself. His protection officer followed at a distance of 30 meters, too far to hear the king-in-waiting's murmured words, but close enough to observe that Charles was speaking, not to anyone visible, not into a phone, but to the air, to the trees, to the land itself. What Charles said that afternoon, alone among the oaks, will never be known with certainty. But what he did in the months that followed suggests a conversation of profound consequence, because it was after Dumfries House that Charles began, for the first time, to study the legal architecture of the royal estates not as a beneficiary, but as an architect. He requested documents that had not been accessed in decades. He met with solicitors whose specialties were so obscure that their names did not appear in any standard legal directory. He was building something, quietly, patiently, with the same devotion he brought to his gardens, his architecture, his watercolors. He was building a fortress inside a fortress, and no one saw it. 1:17 in the morning. Charles sets down his pen. The final page of the amendment is complete. His signature, that distinctive angular hand, the C followed by the R, rendered in a script taught to him by a calligraphy master at Gordonstoun in 1964, sits wet and gleaming at the document's base. Beside it, the date. Beside the date, the invocation, written in the precise legal language prescribed by the 1893 Charter, executed in conditions of complete communicative isolation from the Crown's administrative apparatus, as is my sovereign right and prerogative. The words stare up at him from the cream-colored page, and for the first time tonight, Charles leans back in his chair. The leather creaks beneath him, his eyes close, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he sees, not the document, not the desk, not the study, but a boy. A boy of 10, standing in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, watching his mother wave from a window as a black car carries her away to yet another engagement, yet another duty, yet another day when the institution's needs eclipsed a child's need for presence. Charles has spent his entire life being shaped by the institution, controlled by it, defined by it. And now, in this single night of silence and solitude, he has done something the institution's architects never imagined possible. He has used its own tools to reshape it, not for revenge, not for cruelty, but for something the men in grey will never understand, because their ledgers have no column for it, for legacy, for meaning, for the desperate, agonizing hope that his son will be forced, by constraint, to discover what Charles himself was never given the chance to learn until it was almost too late. That a king's purpose is not in his wealth but in his work. But William does not see purpose. William sees betrayal. At 1:30 in the morning, standing in his darkened study with the phone dead in his hand, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms, confronts a reality so disorienting that his military training, his royal conditioning, his lifetime of emotional management all fail him simultaneously, and he simply stands, motionless, in the dark, breathing. The father who taught him duty has just demonstrated that duty can be redefined without consultation. The man who prepared him for kingship has just altered the terms of that kingship without warning. The sovereign he serves has just reminded him, with devastating finality, that between king and heir there exists an asymmetry of power so absolute that no amount of preparation, no depth of relationship, no strength of filial bond can bridge it. A king can act alone, an heir can only wait. William has been waiting his entire life. Tonight he learns that waiting does not guarantee what was promised. At 2:14 in the morning, a single email penetrates the communications blackout. It arrives not through the palace network, which remains severed, but through a private, personal email address that Charles established years ago under a pseudonym, an address known only to his solicitor and one other person. The email is from William. It contains no greeting, no salutation, no formal address. It consists of 11 words, and those 11 words will never be made public, but their effect is instantaneous and visible. Charles reads them, and his hand, the hand that did not tremble through 14 pages of legal amendments, the hand that held steady through 3 hours of the most consequential writing of his reign, begins, very slightly, to shake. He removes his glasses, he pinches the bridge of his nose, and then he does something he has not done since the night his mother died. He weeps, not loudly, not dramatically. A single line of moisture traces the contour of his left cheek, catches the lamplight for an instant, and falls, silently, invisibly, onto the completed document below. The king weeps, and the clock ticks, and London sleeps, and the House of Windsor holds its breath. By 3 in the morning, the document has been placed in a fire-resistant safe concealed within the study's paneling. A safe whose combination is known only to Charles and whose existence does not appear on any architectural plan or security survey of Clarence House. The crimson ribbon has been retied. A new wax seal has been applied, not the sovereign seal, not the official cipher, but a personal seal that Charles inherited from the Queen Mother, bearing the image of a thistle entwined with a rose. This seal has no legal significance. It has only personal significance, and that, for Charles, is everything. The safe closes with a solid mechanical click, the sound of finality, of commitment, of a decision that cannot now be undone. The key to the safe joins the key to the study door in Charles's waistcoat pocket, and he stands, slowly, feeling the stiffness of hours of concentration in his spine and shoulders. He moves to the window, parts the heavy velvet curtain an inch. Beyond the glass, London is dark and still, the city's sodium glow painting the low clouds a dull amber. Somewhere out there, his son is awake, and furious, and wounded. Charles knows this. He feels it with the particular telepathy of parenthood, the ability to sense your child's pain across any distance, through any wall, despite any silence. But he does not reach for the phone. He does not restore the network, not yet. The amendments require 72 hours of isolation to achieve irrevocable legal standing under the Charter's terms. 72 hours during which no external party can challenge, amend or nullify the sovereign's testamentary decisions. Charles has been in isolation for approximately 5 hours. He has 67 remaining. The morning papers know nothing yet. The BBC's night editor filed an internal query at 2:45, flagging the communications gap, but it was triaged by a senior producer who attributed it to a technical fault and scheduled a follow-up for 9 a.m. The tabloids are running stories about a minor royal engagement and a celebrity divorce. Social media is quiet. The world has not yet woken up to the fact that the King of England has barricaded himself inside his own home and rewritten the financial future of the monarchy. That awakening will come, but not yet. For now, there is only the silence, the deep, institutional, terrifying silence of a palace that has lost contact with its sovereign, and within that silence, the almost imperceptible sound of power being redistributed by a single hand, a single pen, a single man who spent 74 years learning to be king, and is now, for the first time, acting like one. At Kensington Palace, William has not slept. He sits in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, not the drawing room, but the kitchen, the most human room in any palace apartment, the room where titles dissolve and people become simply people. A mug of tea has gone cold in his hands. Catherine entered the room at some point, 2, perhaps 2:30, and sat beside him without speaking, her hand finding his knee beneath the table and resting there with the quiet, absolute solidarity of a partner who understands that some storms must be witnessed, not solved. They did not discuss what was happening. William said only one thing, and he said it to the cold tea rather than to his wife. He's taken it all apart. Catherine's hand tightened on his knee. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a fox screamed in the palace gardens, that unearthly, human sound that foxes make in the dead hours, and neither of them flinched, because tonight, the strange has become ordinary and the ordinary has become impossible. In the comptroller's townhouse, Dawn finds a man transformed. The immaculate charcoal suit has been replaced by a dressing gown. The polished Oxford shoes stand abandoned by the door. The leather portfolio remains on the hall table, open but irrelevant, its documents describing a financial architecture that may no longer exist. The comptroller has spent the night on the telephone, his personal mobile, the only device still functioning, assembling what can only be described as a coalition of alarm. 7 calls to senior legal advisors, 3 calls to members of the Privy Council. 1 call, brief, terse and devastating, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose role as a witness to the sovereign's spiritual welfare gives him, in extremis, the authority to request a wellness check on the monarch. But the Archbishop, after listening in silence for 4 minutes, said only, "If the king has invoked his charter right, we must respect the crown's prerogative. I will pray for wisdom." The comptroller had nearly broken character at that, had nearly said something sharp, something unprofessional, something that acknowledged the absurdity of prayer as a response to constitutional crisis. But he restrained himself. He always restrains himself. It is what the men in grey do. They restrain, they manage, they control. Except tonight, they control nothing. The implications begin to crystallize as the weak January sun creeps above London's rooftops. If the amendments stand, if the 72-hour isolation period completes without legal challenge, the consequences for Prince William are extraordinary. As king, he will inherit the throne, the palaces, the ceremonial role and the public duties. But the Duchy of Cornwall, that engine of independent power, that financial fortress that has for centuries given the heir an identity beyond waiting, will be locked inside a sovereign trust with conditions attached that may take decades to satisfy. William will not be poor. He will not be without resources. But he will be dependent on the very institutional apparatus that his father has just demonstrated can be circumvented, manipulated and weaponized by anyone with sufficient knowledge and sufficient will. The message is unmistakable, even if its intention remains opaque. Power is not inherited, it is built. And if you wish to truly possess it, you must earn it as Charles earned it, through patience, through study, through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of understanding that comes only from decades of attention to detail. Or perhaps the message is darker than that. Perhaps it is not pedagogical, but punitive. Perhaps Charles, in his 75th year, has looked at his eldest son and seen not a worthy successor, but a threat. A man too modern, too efficient, too willing to streamline and rationalize and reduce the duchy to a mere revenue stream rather than a living legacy. Perhaps this is not teaching, perhaps this is war. The truth likely lies somewhere between these poles, in that complex, unresolvable space where love and control become indistinguishable, where a parent's desire to shape their child becomes inseparable from the desire to contain them. Charles loves William. This is not in doubt, but love in the House of Windsor has never been sufficient protection against institutional violence. Ask Diana, ask Harry, ask Margaret, ask Edward VIII. Love and control have always been the monarchy's twin currencies, and tonight, both are in circulation. The broadcast, the inevitable, unavoidable moment when this story reaches the public, will come at approximately 9:14 the following morning, when a junior reporter at Sky News, following up on the BBC's flagged communications gap, reaches a palace press officer who responds to a routine inquiry with 4 words that have never, in the history of royal communications, been issued in sequence. We have no comment. Not the palace declines to comment. Not a statement will be issued in due course. Simply, we have no comment. The absence of protocol in that response tells the reporter everything. Within 30 minutes, the story is on every screen in Britain. Within an hour, it has gone global. Within 2 hours, the footage begins. Cameras outside Clarence House, cameras outside Kensington Palace, cameras outside Buckingham Palace, where the flag flies at full staff because the king is alive and in residence and yet somehow, impossibly, unreachable. 20 million screens flicker simultaneously. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses freeze mid-air. In offices across London, keyboards fall silent. The nation holds its breath and does not know what it is holding it for, because no one outside these palace walls yet understands what has happened. They know only this. The king has gone silent, the air has gone silent, and between those two silences lies something vast and terrible and new. But for now, for this moment, there is only the study at Clarence House, and the king alone within it, and the safe locked behind its panel, and the document within the safe that will reshape a dynasty. Charles stands at his window as dawn breaks. He has not slept, he will not sleep. He has 67 hours remaining, and he will spend each of them exactly as he has spent this night, alone, silent, sovereign. Behind him the desk lamp still burns, the pen still rests in its groove, its nib dried now to a dull blue-black. The clock still ticks. And in the distance, across the frost-covered grounds and the sleeping city, and the cold dark river, William waits, as heirs have always waited, as his father waited, once, for a mother who lived to 96 while her son grew old in her shadow. The cycle continues, the institution endures, the men in gray will recover, will adapt, will find new mechanisms of control. But tonight belongs to the king. Tonight, the machinery is silent. Tonight, a single hand has redrawn the map of Windsor power, and the world sleeps on, undoing. The screen cuts to black, no music, no commentary. Only the silence of a monarchy that, for the first time in living memory, has no idea what happens next.